to testify falsely against Gillich.
Gant agreed to wear a wire and get the offer from Gillich's accomplice on tape. Gant met with him in Mississippi. This time, Gant's tape was rolling when Gillich's associate reiterated the bribe. Gant accepted as Bell had instructed. Now, Bell had the evidence he needed to turn up the heat on Gillich. Just the man who could tell the story from the inside. By 1993, 6 years after the double murder of Vince and Margaret Sherry, FBI agent Keith Bell had put 4 members of the DIXIE Mafia behind bars. But he still had no formal murder convictions against those involved. And Mayor Pete Halat, the suspected mastermind of the case, was still free and running the city of Biloxi. In fact, the year before, Mayor Halat had broken ground on the city's first big casino.
The victory for our town and our people.
The press still hounded Halat about his involvement in the Sherry murders, but he remained adamant about his innocence. Bell continued to work his plan. He used the bribe Robert Gant had recorded on tape to level another charge against Mike Gillich, already in jail. Now Bell indicted Gillich for witness bribery and witness tampering for trying to buy off Gant. And that did the trick.
No doubt the most important turning point was in October of 1993 when Mike Gillich finally decided to cooperate and tell the story of this whole case from an insider's point of view. And that's what really allowed us to bring final resolution to this investigation.
After the years of painstaking work Bell had spent on the case, it was a satisfying moment. Finally, it seemed his patience and ingenuity were paying off. Gillich was in no hurry to accrue more jail time. Bell's relentless pressure had persuaded him to cut a deal before the bribery trial even began. The DIXIE Mafia member would tell what he knew about the murders. Maybe now, Bell could get the convictions he knew were long overdue. But for a career criminal like Mike Gillich, adjusting to life on the right side of the law wasn't easy. At first, he tried to bluff his way out.
Of course, it always takes some time, a period of weeks, to develop some degree of trust and to be able to communicate with someone like this who, for the first time, has decided to leave his lifelong role as a criminal and start cooperating with the FBI.
When deception didn't work, Gillich had no alternative. He had to tell the truth. Now, for the first time, Bell heard the story from an inside source. Gillich knew all the details.
Mike was the center point. Mike knew Kirksey Nix. Mike knew Pete Halat for years. And in fact, when Kirksey Nix was looking for an attorney over in the coast area to represent him on various matters, Mike Gillich introduced Nix into Pete Halat.
He confirmed that Pete Halat was indeed behind the plan to murder the Sherrys, and that the plot grew directly out of the Lonely Heart scam of Angola prison inmate Kirksey Nix. Some months before the Sherrys' deaths, Halat had closed the safe deposit box he and Nix's girlfriend LaRae Sharp had access to, effectively cutting off her access to the money. He then transferred the money into a box only he and Judge Sherry could use. Motivated by greed, he stole $100,000 cash from there. As Nix's trusted accomplice, Palat could blame the theft on Judge Sherry. Next, he went to Mike Gillich with news of the theft.
Mr. Gillich stated that Pete Halat approached Mr. Gillich himself in late 1986 and told Mr. Gillich that much of the money was missing, supposedly around $100,000. And Mr. Halat blamed Judge Sherry for taking the money. Mr. Halat knew that Kirksey Nix would be very furious about this.
It is not known who ordered Margaret's death, but as a fierce opponent of corruption, she posed a threat to the underworld forces hoping to control Biloxi. With Margaret dead, Halat could be free to run the town. Gillich said that he and Halat planned the murders. Ransom and Rhodes provided the murder weapon. But when they passed on doing the hit, Gillich found a replacement. A Texas-based petty criminal named Thomas Holcomb. Holcomb would be paid $20,000 to murder Judge Sherry and his wife. Gillich had also helped provide the car with the help of locksmith Lenny Sweatman. In October of 1996, agents arrested hitman Thomas Holcomb in Texas on murder charges. That same month also saw the arrest that Agent Bell had anticipated and worked 9 years to achieve.
An innocent man, and you're gonna put the cuffs on me?
Let me read you your rights.
The arrest of Pete Halat for the murders of the Sherrys.
You can, anything you say can and will be held against you.
Kirksey Nix and LaRae Sharp were indicted on 52 counts, including fraud, money laundering, and murder. Halat was tried and convicted in the summer of 1997, a full decade after the crimes were committed. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Also tried and convicted were Kirksey Nix and Thomas Holcomb, the hitman. Both were sentenced to life. LaRae Sharp, Nix's girlfriend, got 5 years.
I think a lot of citizens in Biloxi now realize that there are a lot of dedicated professional law enforcement people who will do everything they can to protect the community and work hard to solve major crimes. Perhaps the legacy, you might say, of the case for the criminal element is that they realize after seeing this case that they can commit a crime one day and think they're getting away with it a year later, but it could come back 10 years later and get them.
While the Sherry's killers were finally brought to justice, Margaret Sherry's dream of a Biloxi free of gambling was never realized. Instead, Biloxi has become a resort town filled with casinos and neon lights. The sleepy southern town is gone forever, along with the woman who lost her life trying to save it. New York City's mafia, an organization of brutal gangs. To gain wealth and power, members strong-arm businesses and kill anyone in their way. John Gotti was one of organized crime's fiercest members. He wanted to rule New York City. The FBI had to stop him.
John Gotti was ambitious, powerful, and ruthless. He ruled with flash and conspicuous style, playing celebrity with the media and cat and mouse with the FBI. They called John Gotti the Teflon Don. Serious charges just wouldn't stick. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When John Gotti came to power in 1985, organized crime still had its tentacles spread into many legitimate businesses. Like a game of chess, crime bosses were well insulated by layers of pawns. The FBI's job was to penetrate their defenses and capture the king.
New York is the home of organized crime in America. Through intimidation, terror, and murder, the 5 families that make up New York's mafia have corrupted labor unions, run extortion rackets, and infiltrated almost every major industry in the city. Disputes among the crime families often erupt over who controls which union or what industry. These disputes are inevitably and violently resolved. By the 1970s, the Gambino family had emerged as the most violent and the most powerful crime family in the nation. As that decade came to an end, the FBI decided it was time to stop the mafia's reign of terror. The Bureau's New York office set up 5 squads assigned to investigate and bring down each criminal family. Special Agent Bruce Mao was assigned to supervise the squad responsible for bringing down the Gambino family.
The Bureau realized that we really weren't addressing organized crime here in New York, and so they formed squads to target each particular crime family and try to address the organized crime problem here in New York. So in 1980 we formed the squad, and our target was to put the Gambino family in jail.
The main targets of Mao's investigation were the leaders of the Gambino family. The boss, Paul Castellano, and his underboss, Neil Della Croce. Castellano assumed leadership of the family in 1976, when Carlos Gambino, the namesake of the family, died of natural causes. The FBI were also targeting the most powerful captains in the family, like John Gotti. The captains controlled crews of soldiers who carried out the day-to-day criminal activity for the family. Castellano's crews would commit the actual crimes, but Castellano himself did not. Catching him seemed impossible. As the FBI soon learned, the entire hierarchy of the Gambino family was well insulated. The family army consisted of over 50 captains who controlled over 300 soldiers. It was a large and impenetrable secret society, accessible to outsiders only through the lenses of surveillance cameras. But federal racketeering legislation was passed that made ordering criminal acts as much of a crime as committing the crime itself. In order to successfully prosecute the hierarchy of the Gambino family, the FBI had to secretly get them on tape discussing their criminal enterprise. Mao and his team would have to patiently and methodically work their way into the intricate structure of the Gambino family. It would take years to accomplish that goal. Agents tried to learn more by speaking to residents in the neighborhoods where mob activity was prevalent.
You might recognize somebody. You sure now? Yeah. But take a look. You might recognize one of these guys. Take a look. Take a good look. Take your time.
Few people were willing to talk. Only those on the inside could tell agents who were the real power brokers in the family. Cooperating witnesses and informants had to be developed. Betraying the mafia meant certain death. Informants would be difficult to come by. But some were willing to take the risk. Most were low-level criminals cutting deals with the government to avoid prosecution and long prison sentences. Whatever their motivation, they gave agents something they did not have before: a back door into the Gambino family's criminal operations. Castellano ran the family like a major corporation. Nicknamed within the mafia as the Pope, he used unions to strengthen his grip on various industries in New York. Louis Schilero, head of the FBI's New York office, is an expert on organized crime.
One of the most influential things that the Gambino family did was the control of the labor unions in New York City. They exerted at one time tremendous influence in terms of the Longshoremen's Union, in terms of construction industry trade unions, and in terms of the Teamsters and trucking. By controlling the trade unions in New York City, the Gambino family was able to control construction and certainly had a great influence in the garment center. And that generated a tremendous amount of financial base to the family.
You know, that's the paper trail.
Castellano knew how to keep his interests under control.
Castellano also realized how important it was to rule by fear and terror, so he had several enforcement arms of the family. He had a crew that was famous for killing people, dismembering bodies, and doing all sorts of horrid things. So even though Castellano was known as a businessman's Don, he was a tough guy. He had a hair trigger and temper, and he'd kill you at the drop of a hat.
Getting to Castellano directly would be very difficult. His home in Staten Island was a fortress, under constant supervision by armed guards. He had also installed a sophisticated alarm system.
Didn't you tell me that?
Agents had no solid evidence to suggest that Castellano conducted criminal business in his home. Without such proof, a court would never authorize an FBI bug or a phone wiretap inside the home. Agents hit the streets. They hoped to find one weak link to exploit, one person in the family who made himself vulnerable to electronic surveillance. They learned through informants about a Gambino family crew headed by John Gotti that operated in Queens, headquartered in a private social club called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. A few of the FBI's well-placed informants were close to one of Gotti's lieutenants, a man named Angelo Ruggiero. Though known on the streets as the most vicious gang in the Gambino family, agents believed they found their weak link in Gotti's crew.
And the reason we did was he had a lieutenant named Angelo Ruggiero who ran the day-to-day operations for Gotti and his crew. And Angelo was an attractive target because, number one, he's very active, involved a lot of criminal activity. Number two, he had a big mouth. He talked a lot. He was a gossip and a blabbermouth.
Mal quickly established surveillance teams to identify, record, and log every person who entered the Bergen Club. Agents learned that John Gotti and his crew made money for the family primarily through hijacking, car thefts, extortion, and illegal gambling operations. Informants told agents that Ruggiero sometimes discussed family business on his daughter's phone. He believed the line listed in her name to be free of FBI bugs. Permission to wiretap a private telephone is granted sparingly. Agents must convince a federal judge that the target is engaged in criminal activities and that the wiretap is likely to produce more evidence. If conversations are not of a criminal nature, the wiretap must be turned off. The informant's statements were enough to convince a federal judge in late 1981 that Ruggiero's daughter's phone should be tapped. Mao's squad had found a way to infiltrate the Gambino family. The wiretapping of Ruggiero's phone proved to be one of the most successful wiretaps in FBI history. The conversations overheard by the FBI were damning. But agents learned that Ruggiero also held meetings in his home with Gambino members. Mao and his squad had enough evidence to justify placing a microphone in Ruggiero's home. Agents slipped in, installed the bugs in his dining room, and left without a trace. The success of the Mafia has always been its ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. What Mao and his squad did not know was that a high-ranking police officer was on the Gambino payroll. Though the mole didn't know specific details, he leaked information to family members about ongoing investigations and electronic surveillance operations. Angelo Ruggiero became paranoid that his house was bugged. He searched the house himself, but found nothing. Unconvinced, he called in a professional to conduct a thorough search or sweep for bugs.
Yeah, I need someone to come sweep my house, please.
Ruggiero ordered the sweep on the tapped telephone. When the FBI heard the conversation, they knew they had a crisis.
2345 Richmond Street.
Got a problem.
The phone tap inside the home was immediately turned off to avoid detection.
All that work.
If discovered, it would destroy weeks of diligent work and send the squad back to square one. And there were no targets as talkative as Ruggiero.
Yeah, just come right here. Okay.
The sweeper arrived with the most sophisticated electronic detection equipment available.
Yeah, sounds good.
After 2 days of searching the house top to bottom, he was ready to report his findings to Ruggiero. 2 days after Ruggiero's house was searched for bugs, agents arrested the man who conducted the sweep of his house. What they learned was indeed shocking. He charged Ruggiero thousands of dollars for his services, but none of his detection equipment worked. He had swindled the mob. Fortunately, he had told Ruggiero his house was clean. It was a lucky break for the FBI. Not only had their bugs not been discovered, but now Ruggiero felt confident to speak freely in his house. And he did so with abandon, right into the FBI microphones. Slowly, the FBI was getting closer to the Gambino family hierarchy. To agents, the conversations were a gold mine. As Ruggiero met with his mob partners, the FBI learned of a major heroin trafficking operation conducted by Ruggiero and John Gotti's younger brother, Eugene. Over a 6-month period, Angelo and Eugene Gotti had distributed over 50 kilos of heroin in New York alone. The FBI had every last detail on tape. There was a mafia rule in effect that dealing drugs was strictly prohibited. The punishment for getting caught was execution. No appeal, no trial. Ruggiero did not have the boss's permission to deal drugs, and he knew the consequences. The government felt it had a strong case against Ruggiero and Eugene Gotti. In September of 1983, they were charged with running a major heroin distribution network and obstruction of justice. Though all of those indicted were part of John Gotti's crew, his name was not mentioned in the taped conversations. But with the indictment, Castellano would soon find out that Gotti's men were dealing drugs. Learning of the heroin operation, however, was not the only valuable piece of information learned by agents. Just prior to his heroin indictment, Ruggiero would meet with other soldiers and discuss how he and John Gotti would go to Paul Castellano's house every Sunday for a family meeting.
And then Angelo would give him a blow-by-blow what happened in Paul's house. The Pope did this, the Pope did that, he's mad at this guy. Everything's going in the family, we found out through Angelo's big mouth. And then next day, other soldiers would come over. Of course, Angelo had to reconstruct what happened again. So we found everything was happening in the Gambino family, thanks to Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, and Paul Castellano.
Based on the Ruggiero wire, agents now had probable cause to bug the house of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Getting into Castellano's house took detailed planning and methodical execution. Agents managed to get inside the house and place the bugs. Soon after, they began taping conversations that directly implicated Paul Castellano as the boss of the Gambino family, the man who oversaw a multitude of illegal rackets that cost taxpayers millions of dollars each year. Castellano would meet with his most trusted captains to discuss business. The FBI identified one of those captains as Sammy the Bull Gravano. As his nickname implied, the Bull was both strong and aggressive. He was a boxer and a bodybuilder. He was also the family's top enforcer. Gravano generated his money for the family in the construction industry. He was adept at a number of criminal activities, but his most notorious skill was murder. As the FBI continued to investigate powerful captains in the family like John Gotti and Sammy the Bull, their sights remained focused on the boss. In 1985, 2 years after Ruggiero was indicted, Paul Castellano was arrested and charged along with other New York family bosses with dozens of federal racketeering and conspiracy violations. Out on bail, Castellano continued to run the family, though his attention seemed focused on how to beat the government's case against him. John Gotti was also facing his own legal troubles. An independent investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office ended with Gotti and his mentor, underboss Neil Della Croce, being charged with several counts of racketeering. Della Croce and Gotti were released on bail, allowing them to continue their criminal operations. Months later, Della Croce lay dying of cancer. The FBI had bugged his bedroom. Gotti and Ruggiero visited, and the FBI was listening. They recorded Gotti talking about his fears that Castellano might kill him and Ruggiero for getting caught on tape discussing their drug dealings and for leading the FBI to Castellano's house. The boss wanted to hear the FBI tapes. Della Croce promised Gotti that he would do anything in his power to protect him. Della Croce's loyalty to Gotti was causing a rift in the family. He was stalling the boss, reluctant to turn the tapes over to Castellano. The Gambino family was splitting in two. Then, in early December of 1985, Neil Della Croce, the Gambino family's second in command, died of cancer in his home. On December 16th, 2 weeks after Della Croce's death, Castellano and his new underboss, Tommy Bellano, pulled up to a fashionable steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan to meet some associates for dinner. As they started to exit the car, several men approached them and began firing. Castellano and Bellotti never knew what hit them. They were killed instantly. When the boss of a family is assassinated, the FBI believes that the person responsible is usually the one who steps up and assumes leadership of the family. It was mafia tradition to pay tribute to a new boss, to show him respect. 2 weeks after the murder, agents watched a parade of high-level Gambino family members enter the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. They were meeting with John Gotti. Agent Mao and his squad would have to restructure their attack on the Gambino hierarchy. John Gotti was the new boss of the family. Agents pieced together his criminal history and traced his rise to power. John Gotti became a Gambino family associate around 1970. He impressed the boss in 1973 by killing a man who had kidnapped and murdered a relative of Carlos Gambino. Gotti served 2 years for the hit before he was paroled. Upon his release, he quickly gained respect within the family. He began to make a great deal of money for the family through loan sharking and gambling operations. In his neighborhood, he became a hero of sorts, throwing huge 4th of July parties every year, complete with fireworks. Special Agent George Gabriel was assigned to Mao's squad in 1985. He quickly became an expert on John Gotti.
He took care of if there were old ladies that were in need. If he had money in his pocket, he'd give it out. He was, in some respects, a Robin Hood in his neighborhood. And that's how he carried himself. But how did he make that money? By killing, by robbing, by manipulating, by bribing, by controlling rackets that he didn't have a right to control. And that's a side, when he didn't like you, when you fell on the wrong side of John, you died. I mean, there was no mercy. You died. There was no two ways about it.
Gotti was now the king. He found himself in command of a multi-million-dollar crime network made up of scams he did not know existed. He had a lot to learn. With their bugs and surveillance, Special Agent Gabriel and the rest of the FBI squad learned right along with him.
John Gotti took over that family. He had to learn what the rackets were, and as he's learning them, we're learning them. Who's got what industries, who's collecting from what unions. He's asking captains to give him a list of all the soldiers in there and their crews, so he could know who he's got in his family and how many.
Gotti was the boss, but he still had legal troubles. 6 months after becoming the head of the family, he was sent to jail to await trial on loan sharking and gambling charges. Jail didn't slow him down, though. From his cell, Gotti ordered a murder. It was against Robert DiBernardo, who had been a close associate of Gotti. DiBernardo's assassination was set up by Angelo Ruggiero, who was still awaiting trial for his 1983 drug indictment.
Angelo's one of the few guys who's got access to John in jail and tells him that Robert DiBernardo is talking subversive behind John's back, the boss's back. He's saying that John isn't fit as the boss and we should appoint somebody else as the boss. Angelo wants this done because Angelo owes Robert DiBernardo a lot of money and he doesn't want to pay him back.
I was going over some of these contracts here. This public housing contract.
On Gotti's behalf, Ruggiero asked Sammy the Bull Gravano to set up the hit.
You want some coffee? Yeah, that'd be great. Give him some coffee, will you?
On June 5th, 1986, DiBernardo showed up for a meeting at Gravano's construction office. Everyone greeted him as usual. DiBernardo must have suspected nothing.
You know, we got all those contracts.
He was shot in the head from behind. His body was never found. The FBI learned of his death through informants. Agents believed Gotti's crew was responsible for the murder, but they needed proof. In August of '96, 2 months after the DiBernardo hit, Gotti went to trial for the gambling and loan sharking charges filed 2 years before. But Gotti had not been the primary target of that indictment. The case was originally designed to bring down underboss Neil Della Croce. The case against Gotti was never that strong, but an ambitious U.S. attorney saw an opportunity to get a mob boss. Though the case did not involve Mao's squad, he sent George Gabriel to observe the trial. During a break in the proceedings, Gabriel came face to face with his adversary.
I introduced myself. I told him I'm George Gabriel. I'm with the FBI. I work on Bruce Mao's squad. He says, you tell him I'm going to be home in 6 weeks. I'm going to beat this one. I said, right, I'll deliver your message. I said, and if you do, I'll be there to congratulate you because it'll be a good job on your part. He says, good, I hope to see you.
On March 13th, 1987, Gotti was acquitted on all counts. George Gabriel made good on his promise. After the verdict, Gabriel went to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, where Gotti was having an acquittal party. He congratulated Gotti. To the press, the public, and to prosecutors, John Gotti seemed untouchable. Out of jail, John Gotti resumed his celebrity status. Around town, he was seen at fine restaurants and glitzy nightclubs, always immaculately dressed. Already he was known as the Dapper Don. Now, with his acquittal, he earned the title of the Teflon Don. Charges slid right off him. To the media, he was glorified as the underdog who took on and beat the government. But now, it was Mao's turn to make a case against Gotti.
I get upset when they glorify a guy like that. To me, he's just a common thug, a criminal. He's a terrorist. He doesn't believe in our government. He doesn't believe in voting, doesn't believe in church, doesn't believe in family. He's a mass murderer. How can you glorify this guy and make him a role model for your kids? It's very upsetting to me.
In order to make his case against Gotti, Mao had to find out where he was conducting his business. The FBI bugs planted at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club had dried up. Since becoming boss, Gotti wasn't spending as much time there. The squad leaned hard on informants to find out where Gotti held his high-level meetings. It took 8 months, but in early 1988, they finally found Gotti's new headquarters. Gotti turned the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy into his headquarters. It was a symbolic gesture on Gotti's part. The Ravenite was his mentor Neil Della Croce's old club. Here, Gotti would meet with